to what causes it, what's going on inside of a person who has ADHD. So as we said, there is a genetic connection. Way back in the 80s, a researcher by the name of Kenneth Blum isolated a gene which was called the A1 allele of the D2 dopamine receptor defect. And once they'd isolated this gene, they started studying different populations, and they found that this particular defect, this particular variant of your genetic structure, was found in significant populations. Now, the way that this works is if you have this gene in your system, it basically tampers with the circuitry or the chemistry even of your central nervous system. And what we call the brain reward cascade is literally a chain reaction of chemical reactions that go on in your brain when you're doing normal things. So what happens with a normal person is as they're going through a normal day-to-day activity, different chemicals are set off in your nervous system, and for a normal person what happens is they set off one after the other in like a waterfall situation, and when it gets to the bottom of the waterfall, what you get is the release of things like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine. They're the chemical names of what's going on inside your brain. But what that feels like to you when you get those chemicals released into your body is you literally get what's called a state of well-being. You feel good, you get a bit of a kick, a bit of a buzz out of having done that. What we know with the A1 allele defect is that basically it leads to breaks in this waterfall, so that these people who have this particular problem, when they're doing normal things, they don't get that same sense of reward. They don't get the same feeling of achievement out of that particular thing. So we can understand why that might lead to impulsive behaviour, because they have to behave more to get that response. Hyperactive, they need to be busier. They need to be physically more attentive than, or not attentive, they need to be physically more active than the rest of us to get a state of well-being. So here's what the experts said. Back in 1998, the National Institutes of Health put together an expert panel where they literally wanted to get down to the nuts and bolts of ADHD. And here were their conclusions. We don't have an independent valid test for ADHD. There are no data to indicate that ADHD is due to brain malfunction, even despite some of the research that's coming out. Existing studies come to conflicting conclusions as to whether use of psychostimulants increases or decreases the risk of abuse. And finally, after years of clinical research and experience with ADHD, our knowledge about the cause or causes of ADHD remains speculative. It's a little bit depressing almost, isn't it, when this is actually the experts of the world getting together, and they're literally getting to the point of frustration of saying, we just don't know enough about this syndrome. We've got little pieces in the puzzle, but we just don't have the whole jigsaw put together. This gets a little bit scary when you start to look at some of the other possible factors that can lead into these problems in terms of the central nervous system. What we're talking about is post-encephalitic syndrome, which is basically, this is what Harris Coulter, who is one of the top medical experts in terms of vaccination injuries. And this is a little bit depressing because he says developmental or learning disabilities are nearly always generated by encephalitis, which is a swelling of the lining of your brain. And the primary cause of encephalitis in the USA and other industrialised countries is the childhood vaccination program. We know that certain kids have reactions to vaccinations. It's a fact of life. Perhaps it's underreported, we're not really sure, because there is no systematised way of people monitoring reactions and problems after vaccination. But we do know that kids can have allergic reactions to the active ingredient. We know that there's chemicals, there's preservatives, there's chemicals that heighten the body's response, and they can cause allergic reactions. We also know that there's contaminants that get into the vaccines, and they too can cause these sorts of reactions. So you're literally talking about almost like a really mild meningitis sort of a thing after a vaccination. So usually you probably would have known, you would have noticed something over the 2 to 4 weeks after one or all of the vaccinations, that there was some sort of an excessive reaction going on other than just your normal immune reaction. So how do we determine whether someone has ADHD? Because obviously that's getting more into the nuts and bolts. You know, if I suspect that my child has this sort of problem, or if I suspect that I have this problem myself, how am I going to find out whether I actually have it or whether it might be something else going on? As we said before, there actually is no single test to diagnose ADHD. Occasionally when you read the magazines, you know, about, and they'll have an article and they'll give you a little checklist, and you go through and check them, and you know, you literally convince yourself. I actually did when I first started studying this particular topic. About 2 months into studying it, I actually convinced myself that I actually had ADHD because, you know, I actually showed some of the characteristics. And it probably is. I probably do have a degree of it, but which is maybe that's why I'm interested in it. But ultimately, there is more stringent ways of figuring out whether it's truly affecting your lifestyle. So it's important that your assessment is multimodal. It needs to be include academic, social, emotional, function and developmental levels. It needs to be tailored to the age of the child. I hear more and more about kids who preschool age are, you know, being diagnosed with this, and it gets a bit concerning when you see the way that it's diagnosed. And as I mentioned before, there is a checklist. This was, remember how we talked about 1987, the APA put together that classification. What they did in that process was they listed off all of the characteristic, you know, attributes of someone with ADHD, and this is now used as almost like a checklist where you go through and you know, tick them off, and if you get enough scored, then you perhaps have the syndrome. And then obviously you need to rule out other problems. Particularly the number one thing your child needs to be tested for is their thyroid function. Some children with hyper or hypothyroids can show a lot of these characteristics. So if you're having a child diagnosed with this problem, then make sure that this is one of the things that gets ruled out. So this is the DSM-4. This is the psychiatric, you know, analysis or classification of ADHD. So this was in the manual. You can get your hands on this on the internet, on a lot of websites. You can find these checklists. But as we said before, there's the three main symptoms. There's inattention, hyperactivity and impulsivity. So what the checklist does, it helps you to determine what degree you have or your child has at each of these things. Now this is the first key point about this checklist, and this is something that doesn't often get mentioned in the magazines. Now the patient needs at least 6 symptoms of the inattention, or at least 6 symptoms of the combined hyperactivity impulsivity list. And if they're going to be a combined sort, then they need 6 of each. They don't need 6 between the 2 different groups. So here's the list of inattention. Often ignores details, makes careless mistakes. And the key word in all of these, you'll see it's on the start of every sentence, is the word often. This needs to be consistent. It needs to be there pretty much all the time, not just something that's there you know, on the weekends or if the child's tired or grumpy. Often has trouble sustaining attention in work or play. Often does not seem to listen when directly addressed. My wife would definitely say that I got that one. Often does not follow through on instructions, fails to finish. Often has difficulty organising tasks and activities. Often avoids activities that require a sustained mental effort. Often loses things he or she needs. Often gets distracted by extraneous noise. And is often forgetful in daily activities. That point H, often gets distracted by extraneous noises, links in with that reward deficiency that we were talking about. The other thing that does to a person is it tampers with their ability to filter out external noises. So for an average person, if you were sitting in front of you and you were talking to them, they would be listening to you and they would be focusing to you. Someone who has, you know, the very severe cases of this, they won't just be hearing you, they'll also be hearing what's going on outside in the street. They'll be hearing what's on in the television in the background. They'll be hearing a mouse, you know, somewhere in the corner of the room. And they'll be tending to having trouble focus on you because they're actually focusing on a lot of other things. So that explains quite often a lot of these symptoms. As we said, there's the impulsivity and hyperactivity list as well. So if you get 6 of those inattention, then you could be, you know, suspected of having inattentive style of probably ADD. Whereas if you show up with 6 of those, you'd be